Good day, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Discussing Philosophy with Miela and Fatima. Now, let us discuss Unit 3, Module 1 under Professor Aquinius' book, The Subject Matter of Formal Deductive Logic. Starting off with what is formal deductive logic? It is the process we follow in determining the validity or invalidity of an argument. Through argument forms, the essence of argument is found. This is according to formal logicians. While these forms will later be discussed in the following slides, in order to identify an argument's validity, it is restated and simplified in a logical form. Through this, ideas are easier to understand, which makes it easier for an argument's form to be identified. Let's take a look at an example for us to have a visual representation of the statement I mentioned earlier. This way, we'll be able to understand the actual context of the essence of a logical form of an argument. So here we can see an example. If Fido is a puppy, then Fido is a young dog, which is a premise. And Fido is a puppy, another premise, and a conclusion, therefore Fido is a young dog. We could observe that the argument stated in number 1 is stripped down to numbers 2 and 3. In our math class, we have discussed premises and conclusions. In this example, numbers 1 and 2 are the premise and 3 is the conclusion. The example given is a deductive argument as it consists of 2 premises and 1 conclusion. A ratio of 1 to 1 argument is considered regardless of the number of premises. It all depends on the number of the conclusion. Now, let us go back to what we have discussed in the previous unit. In identifying the truth value of the premise or premises in conclusion, this principle must also be followed. Thus, the truth value may either be true or false only. The principle we're talking about here is the principle of excluded middle. Now let us look at what we call a logical structure. Before the validity of an argument is inspected, it must be presented in a logical structure first. It defines the hierarchy of information and the relation between different parts of the document. Now let's take a look at this example. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. The difference between a logical form and a logical structure is the stripping off of the content. In the example given earlier, Fido and Puppy were present, but in forming a logical structure, the content is extracted, leaving only the structure of the argument. We can see here that the statement Fido is a puppy is replaced or represented by P. Consequently, the statement Fido is a young dog is replaced or represented by Q. After we have formed the logical structure of an argument, we will be able to identify the argument form. Now let us go back to the argument forms. The example argument earlier is in the argument form modus ponens. We may be familiar with this as we have discussed this in our math class already. Arguments in this form are considered valid. When an argument is valid, in all cases of substitution of its value, a case where the premise set is true but the conclusion is false is not possible. If an argument is formed this way, then it is invalid. By looking at this example, we can visualize and look how it differs from the former argument form. Now, a premise set is formed when there are 2 or more premises in an argument. Aside from the mentioned combination of truth values that forms an invalid argument, all the other possible combinations of truth values make up a valid argument. You can see here in the table. When we take into context our lessons in Math 10 about logic, we will understand why a combination of true and false forms an invalid argument. For the instance of having valid argument with false premises or premise and a false conclusion, it may sound counterintuitive if taken from an empirical view, but the terms true and false are used analytically to represent truth values. This is also the reason why some logicians replace true with the number 1 and false with the number 0 to avoid empirical meaning attached to the terms true and false. Now let us look at the essence of deductive arguments. A philosopher named Max Hopwood claims this. What this claim implies is that logic is gained through thorough understanding by deduction or the process of narrowing down from general to specific. It also claims that reasoning is either valid or invalid. this process of reasoning can be applied to different areas including probability inference. We also compare deductive reasoning with inductive reasoning. It works differently in different fields. This claim explains one of the essences of deductive reasoning. Logicians strayed away from studying arguments based on their natural setting, through ordinary language. They prefer studying an argument's logical form than its empirical or evaluative content. Logicians' concern is the validity or invalidity of an argument as well as its essence. Argument form turned out as a concept that these logicians were looking for. An argument form is a concept that matches the logician's concern or focus. It was also by this property of an argument that logicians prefer as the standard or validity of invalidity and invalidity is applicable to any and all possible works. Formal logic is described as a tool that helps us in identifying valid arguments and avoid invalid arguments. These invalid arguments are also referred to as formal fallacies as they are invalid but are still formal in form, while deductive logic is a formal science unlike mathematics. And just like any other formal science, deductive logic does not have any empirical content. Its principles are normative, which means that it does not actually explain how people compose arguments like in descriptive sciences. Now that we're done with Unit 3 Module 1, let us move on to Unit 4 Module 1, the opposite of our first discussion, the subject matter of informal logic. Contrary to what we discussed about the subject matter of formal logic, we will now discuss the subject matter of informal logic. Unlike formal logicians, informal logicians focus on studying arguments based on their natural setting rather than their logical form. They also study the discarded content of an argument that formal logicians take as an irrelevant part. Gavier argues that formal logic doesn't discuss a deeper understanding of matters such as ambiguities, diversity, pros and cons of an argument, and credibility. It is a gap that informal logic fills in as it dwells on studying these matters. Now let us go back to Ludwig Wittgenstein. In the context of Wittgenstein, there are several types of arguments that are used naturally in various language games. Thus, informal logic helps us to identify, understand, and evaluate arguments based on how it is used in everyday life. If we look at both arguments closely here in our slide, we can observe that the invalid argument's conclusion, therefore it reign, is strongly supported by the true premises. However, the modus ponens, or the valid argument's conclusion, is not quite supported by these two premises. If we analyze it deeper, the intensity of the rain was not stated clearly, which keeps us from concluding that it actually filled the whole dam. But if we see that the dam is full, then we can conclude that it rained. Now let's look at Copy's definition. Copy's definition simply means that an argument's premises must strongly support and serve as a ground for reason for believing the conclusion. If it fails to do so, then the conclusion will not follow accordingly. Now let us look at more counterexamples. If we look closely at these instantations, the conclusions are actually strongly supported by the premises, although it is not in the formal logic form. If we only look at the logical form of an argument, we may fail to recognize if the premise provides strong support of the conclusion. Thus, we'd most likely skip studying arguments of the like. If we go back and look at the arguments earlier through Johnson's perspective here, we will easily identify the premise are true and that the truth of the conclusion is confirmed by the truth of the premises in a non-deductive way. The three examples are analytic arguments. An analytic argument are the claims or the conclusions that are based on the analysis of meanings of the subject and predicate of the premises and conclusion. The claims of the conclusion are based on the analysis of meanings of the subject and predicate of the premises and conclusion. A formal logic being invalid is not the issue that concerns the informal logicians, but the various types of context in different language games. By this, it is also unfortunate that there is a vast number of the domains in the informal logic which makes identifying all of it difficult. Well, here we have the basic issues in informal logic. First is the mold of informal logic. Informal logicians try to avoid traditional models as they believe that these are molds of formal logic. Deductive arguments are not genuine. Some believe that deductive arguments are not genuine as they only form inferences and not genuine arguments. And here we have debate on the number of types of arguments, relation of premise to conclusion, relevance of premise and conclusion, and the subject matter of informal logic is in turmoil. An argument must not be defined merely based on looking for its essence, as it will not be found. The idea of Ludwig must be taken into account because if we continuously look over or overlook invalid arguments, we may commit mistakes which leads to rejecting non-deductive arguments as counterfeit arguments. The evaluative aspects of an argument may vary from one language game to another. That is why the identification of the language game is important to further analyze the argument. Since informal arguments are not as tight, precise, and well demarcated as formal arguments, we must not analyze an argument with preconceived ideas in mind, but also look at the similarities and differences of an argument. Now, for the next part of our discussion, we have Fatima.
Next, we move on to Unit 4, Module 2, the analysis of natural arguments. So this states that the theory of argument must facilitate the acquisition of a step-by-step procedure. This is in order to impart a set of analytic skills for composing an argument. This includes the metacognitive skill of criticizing an argument and preparing to compose the counter-argument, and the metacognitive skill of evaluating the strength of argument and counter-argument with strengthening the weaker argument. So the theory of argument has two main components, the theory of analysis and theory of appraisal. For the theory of analysis, this answers the questions: how is an argument defined? What is the purpose of an argument? And how many types of arguments are there? While for theory of appraisal, this answers the questions: how should an argument be evaluated and criticized? And how to determine whether a premise is relevant or not? And what are the appropriate standards to measure the argument's strength? So for the theory of analysis, how is an argument defined? The definition of an argument, according to the book, is that an argument is any discourse, whether it is oral or written, in which some statements are used as reason, justification, or evidence in order to support the claim of another statement. The claim of the statement may be something true, false, or probable, something good or bad, right or wrong, desirable or undesirable. So the part of the discourse used to support the claim is called the premise, and the part of the discourse that is supported by the premise is called the conclusion. So this definition covers all types of arguments that can occur in any language game. This is for the reason that if the definition is too strict and too precise, then it excludes arguments from other language games. Then if it is too loose, it may include discourse without discernible premise or conclusion. With this, we can infer that any discourse with a discernible claim, like opinions, belief, knowledge claims, as long as it is supported by reasons, justifications, or evidence, then it is considered as an argument. So, the claim of the conclusion is not limited to truth values, but it also includes evaluative claims like good or bad, right or wrong. And then, since a discourse is supported by reasons, then it can be evaluated as either very good, fair, or bad. This evaluation depends on the strength of support that the reasons provide to the claim. So, the informal logic has two basic aims, which are to understand how a conclusion is supported by the premise or premises in a discourse in a natural language. And then second is to develop the criteria for judging whether the support offered by the premise or premises is very strong, fair, weak, or poor. And then we move on to the purpose of an argument. The practice of argumentation is teleological. The argumentation clearly serves to help us achieve many different goals. So among them are persuasion, justification, inquiry, belief maintenance, decision making, and so forth. So it is important to note that an argument is successful only if the conclusion is accepted on the basis of the premises that is offered. We should only accept the conclusion if the premises offered are very strong. Next, we move on to the types of arguments. For the types of arguments, we have three, which are the empirical argument, the analytic argument, and the evaluative argument. So an empirical argument has a conclusion that something is empirically true, false, or probable. It may be an opinion, belief, or knowledge claims. An example would be arguing from the characteristic of a sample to a characteristic of a population. So when you say most politicians are corrupt because all the politicians I'm acquainted with are all corrupt, then you're making an empirical argument. So empirical conclusions are either true, false, or probable, and they must have premises that are empirical. Premises that provide evidence to verify the truth or probability of the conclusion. Next is the analytic argument. So for analytic argument, the conclusion is making an analytic claim, and it is supported by analytic definitions or well-formed formulas. An example of this would be when you say this piece of land must be a triangle because it contains 3 sides and 3 angles. So the proof to confirm the truth of the conclusion is an analytic definition, which is that all triangles have 3 sides and 3 angles. Next, for the evaluative argument. The conclusion claims that something is good or bad, right or wrong, moral or immoral. So, arguments like moral, legal, religious, and aesthetics is under the evaluative argument. Like, for example, when you say that it is morally wrong to torture a human being for fun because this is a violation of his or her human right. Every human being should be treated with respect and dignity. There is no known society or culture in the world that will sanction the torture of a human being for fun. Then you're making an evaluative argument. This conclusion is supported by reason, which may either be empirical or evaluative, like a moral rule. So we can see here that when you accept the premise to be true and correct, then you cannot help but to also accept that the conclusion is right. So this implies that the support offered by the premises to its conclusion is very strong. When you accept a premise, then you accept that the conclusion is correct. The degrees of support for this can belong to a continuum of very strong, moderately strong, weak, poor, or no support. Next would be the theory of appraisal. Its basic aim is to provide a criteria for judging the strength of support by the premise to the claim of the conclusion. So, we examine the conclusion and ask 2 questions. The first one is, what is the nature of the claim of the conclusion? Is it analytic? Is it empirical? Or is it evaluative? And then we ask, what is the required evidence or justification to prove the claim of the conclusion? For here, we must be able to sort out various kinds of epistemic claims and determine the required evidence or justification to establish the claim. We provide a criteria for estimating the epistemic force of reasons or evidence that support the different types of claims. So the evidence offered by the premise is set to verify, confirm, or justify the conclusion. It means that if the evidence offered is closer, then the stronger the argument. So closer to the required evidence, the stronger the argument. To answer the question, how to determine whether a premise is relevant or not. The premise is relevant to a conclusion just in case it can verify, confirm, or justify the claim of the conclusion. So, if it has a stronger support, then it means that there is the greater relevance. And then lastly, the appropriate standards for measuring the argument strength. So we have three types of arguments, right? So we have three different standards for measuring the strength of the argument for each. So for empirical argument, the criteria for judging the strength is measured in terms of the evidence offered by the premise to verify the truth or probability of the conclusion. While for analytic argument, the criteria rest on the stability or how stable is the truth of the analytic statement, which is often an analytic definition or some formal science, which we have discussed a while ago. Then lastly, for evaluative argument, the criteria for judging the strength rests on the extent of public acceptance or what we call the intersubjective consensus regarding the moral principle offered to justify an evaluative. With this, we end our discussion. Thank you so much for listening and staying till the very end. We hope that you have a nice day ahead.